So, welcome to the class on dance footwork and not sweating it. So, we'll begin with an evening ball. The first dance will be Jealousía for three couples. Please take your partners. And of course, as the dance masters say this, all the gentles rise and begin to vacate the room. All too often, this is where we find ourselves in Eldermere when attending events with dancing penciled in. Right. Indeed, one cannot ignore the reality that many balk at the very idea of partaking in dance. And when the ball is announced as imminent, the majority pack their bags and head for home. But today I'm not here to provide rebuttals for those who argue that dancing is not fun. I'm not going to offer counterpoints to arguments that dancing doesn't help fighters improve their game, and somehow manage to bite my tongue on the issue of some men not seeing dance as being manly enough to deserve their attention. No. Today, I'm going to speak to those who already profess at least a mild interest in dance. A belief that it's good and fun and an important part of the society, and yet who still do not dance. Not due to a lack of faith in the art itself, but due to a lack of faith in themselves. Here, I refer to anxiety. Imagine the gentle who claims that they have two left feet, which I might add is one more foot than one-legged dancers I've seen, and two more working limbs than those I've seen who dance in wheelchairs. Imagine the lord who's afraid of stepping on someone's feet, or of tripping over their own, or picture the lady who is concerned that everyone is watching and will know if she places a single foot wrong, or moves in the wrong direction. The footwork is everything to these nobles, and in their minds they just can't learn fast enough. They won't succeed. As a perfectionist myself, I can empathize with this fear of wrongdoing, and any noble wanting to maintain social standing and honor must heartily agree that one should strive for exceptional performance. Fabrizio Caruso himself, most famous dance master and trusted primary source for all things 16th century Italian dance, insisted that one should follow all the rules of dancing and refrain from that which was most false. But one admission deserves another, and I would be remiss to neglect to mention one thing. Perfect footwork in the SCA is impossible. I would in fact argue that imperfection is not only the norm, but in some cases in period, and even in modern day, would be preferable, more desirable, than following prescribed and so-called perfect footwork patterns. Scandalous, I know, and I'm sure that dance laurels from faraway kingdoms have collectively gasped in indignation, their intuition telling them that an arrogant little upstart somewhere in the known world said something a little too big for his britches. But before everyone jumps on me, because I'm not a dance laurel, hear me out. So you've seen the roadmap that I was going to take, beginning with Caruso the Curmudgeon. Other titles will eventually make sense. So to begin my self-defense, I returned to Master Caruso the Curmudgeon and his manuscripts covering the 16th century Italian dance. Now, there's a reason he gets so much flack, and sometimes we pick on him in dance circles, right? In Nobiltà di Dame, his second dance manual, was published just after 1600, he arguably focuses more on what you shouldn't do rather than what you should. And the reason, I think, is obvious. He saw more nobles dancing in a variety of ways he thought was acceptable, right? He saw nobles doing footwork their own way. He saw them doing their own variations. He saw them doing things that he thought was most false. Because in his mind, there was only one way to perform a proper grave reverence, damn it, and he was going to make sure that those kids with their hen-laying and egg postures going to get off his lawn. He actually does reference such a thing, by the way. On page 140 to 141, he does note that someone should not bend as others do, so straight down, for to him that would therefore create a posture akin to a hen laying an egg. How unseemly. He even tries to convince his readers and people and other dancers that dance masters other than him and experts other than him were not as right on what should be considered perfect footwork. On pages 116 to 18, for example, he discusses Galliard variations, and more on that later. He admits that there exist experts in the field of dance who perform one Galliard variation on the left foot leading, and then instead of performing the same variation on the right foot, right, to create the symmetry, they do a different Galliard variation on the right foot. How scandalous. And how improper. Heaven forbid someone should follow their example and not Caruso's. It's quite clear, to me at least, how much effort he spent trying to correct quote unquote dancers. The majority were content to just do their own thing. They learned regional variations from other dance masters. They copied step patterns from other dancers that they encountered. They moved how they pleased, and whether he likes it or not, they enjoyed themselves just as much. The world did not sit on fire. Important marriages and family alliances were not torn asunder. The nobility as a whole in Italy did not collectively fall from grace. Much to Caroso's disappointment, there was no other consequence than his scorn and disdain when other gentles decided to improvise, to vary, to ornament, and modify dance steps as they saw fit. His idea of perfect was just a subjective opinion, and although we are and should be thankful for all of his efforts to document 16th century Italian dance, I believe that he in himself is most false in his assertion that his instructions are immutable and definitive. The very fact that he corrected himself, claiming that that he had published years earlier in Il Ballerino, his first manuscript, when he corrected himself and said that what he had written there was wrong, he proved enough that his own footwork, the footwork he laid down, was no more perfect than any others. So inevitably, people still chose imperfection. He never did convince everyone in the known world to dance his way as opposed to their own. And speaking of other period footwork repertoires, let's move on to Arbeau, the permissive. As with Caroso, he certainly had ideas about how steps should be performed, right? He even included iconography along with his instructions, a practice which was pretty uncommon, actually, for the time, and more on that later. But he was less of a curmudgeon about how closely things should be followed than Caroso, in terms of what was acceptable. I mentioned earlier the Galliard variations that Caroso wrote about, so let's continue with that a little further. Arbeau wrote a great deal on Galliards in his publication entitled Orchesography, which was published in 1589. The manual is written as a dialogue between himself, which is a pen name, but Arbeau is a pen name, but it's between himself and a dance student named Capriole, and the latter who is receiving the master's instruction throughout the book. All throughout, Arbeau notes the reality and importance of variation in footwork. For example, on page 99, when discussing the dance entitled Romanesque, he recounts to Capriole how, although it was not one of his favorites to dance, it also seemed to me that the steps were well accented by those who danced it. Now, accented here suggests to me that dancers flourished and added ornamentation, rather than suggesting that they simply danced the exact same footwork as their neighbor, just more perfectly. Arbeau goes one step further later on and even claims that such ornamentation lends grace to the dancer who chooses to add it to their footwork and who chooses to deviate from what is expected. When Capriole asks on page 102 why a postule droit was not followed by a petit saut, as is custom, Arbeau replied, one must surmise that dancers have found that the introduction of a few pleasing variations lends grace. Remember when I mentioned earlier that not following prescribed footwork could be desirable in some cases? Well, here's one. Contrary to Caroso, Arbeau carried on with this claim that dancers could be left to determine what was best instead of insisting that there was only one true way to perform a given dance or movement. For example, going further in the book, on page 104, Arbeau tells Capriole that whether or not a given galliard can be varied is left to the dancer's choice, and that if he wishes, he may proceed to a new variety of 5 steps, and in this he cannot err. Remember those last words. When Capriole sought confirmation that by combining different movements you have shown me I could compose many 5 steps to my own fancy, Arbeau doesn't renege on his previous assertion. He replies, certainly you could. So, remember when Caroso acknowledged that there existed other experts who did things differently than he would have liked? Arbeau recognized this too, only with a little more humility. There are an infinity of varieties, he says, which you will obtain and learn from those of your own generation. This admission, which was on page 107, says a lot about how normal it was at the time for dancers in period to shirk the notion that there was a set of perfect footwork to learn and master. Instead, variation in adding one's own flair was by far more common and, in Arbeau's view, expected. And while some might jump in here and claim that this truth only applies to the Galliard and Saltarello as they were improvisational dances by nature, It's not entirely accurate. Later on in the book, on page 175, Arbeau discusses brawls, which we know in Dance Today in the SCA, as non-improvisational things. Yet he mentions here that gavottes are a miscellany of double brawls, danced in duple time, and like the common brawl consist of a double à droite and a double à gauche. But the dancers divide up the doubles, both those to the right and to the left, by passages borrowed at will from the galliard. In this case, Arbeau is telling us of nobles who, yet again, do not follow set footwork patterns all the time, instead choosing to liven a typically non-improvisational dance by, in fact, improvising it. And Arbeau doesn't just report this as a fact, but he gives it his blessing. He says, "You will adapt the above divisions to it, or such others, as it pleases you to select or devise, or to copy from accomplished and nimble dancers. If this sort of dance had been fashionable when I had a young pair of legs, I should have not failed to make notes upon it." So there you have it. Other ways of dancing are just fine, according to him. None are inherently perfect or more correct. And of course, one could interject and suggest that just because regional variations existed did not mean that within one's area one could not expect to find a quote-unquote standard way of dancing that local nobles would be expected to follow. Dancing in a way that was wildly different from the local norm might make one stick out in a bad way. Also a fair point, but it starts to ignore the teachings of the Book of the Courtier. For to err is human, but not noble. Written by Baldassare Castiglione in 1516, although it was published later in 1528, the Book of the Courtier details the proper behavior of nobles and other influential members of the peerage, and how one might best earn the highest of graces, the highest of honors, the highest respect. Now, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, he claims that nobles already possess a great deal of grace and honor, and they're worthy of respect by their very nature. Right? In chapter 14 of book 1, he details how every one of them are preferred and favored by God himself, seemingly fashioned by his hand to be endowed with all the talents that befit someone of the nobility, as opposed to being made or trained or taught. Right? Just inherently possessing these good qualities. Furthermore, nobles are said to have an inherent drive to excel at all things that will bring them further honor and virtue. Now, should they fail to succeed at this, it's not because of some flaw that they have, but must be because they were not truly trying. Or perhaps they were a poor sufferer of a poor teacher. Right? Someone stifled their inherent excellence, like trying to snuff out a candle. And it's worth mentioning here that a way in which nobles could seek to further their reputation, and something that they were thought to be inherently good at, was dancing. And though it may seem that some nobles are quote-unquote better or even more graceful than others, Castiglione repeatedly made the argument that it must be because the one noble who appears to be better, who appears to be more graceful, has simply practiced ways to highlight this natural grace that they possess, that highlight their natural excellence more than the second one. It's not because the second one does not possess that grace in equal measure, or excellence in equal measure, merely that they have not practiced making it more obvious. Think of a page from a textbook. One student chooses to highlight a particular sentence in their textbook, and the other doesn't. Both pages contain the same information. One student has just made the other one look a bit more obvious. All of this is to say that should a modern-day Scadian not be perfect at dancing, it's not that they are dancing wrongly, or poorly, or incorrectly. According to Castiglione, they're simply inventing their own personal interpretation, finding the standard work to be uninspiring for their superior God-given intellect. Or perhaps you just weren't truly trying, treating the dance less as a serious endeavor and more of something for a bit of amusement and distraction. Or it could be that you were just taught poorly, or stifled by a poor partner of lower station who is not as worthy of you. In the same vein was I taught when playing in a musical ensemble, the novice musician will apologize for their mistake. An intermediate musician will just say nothing and move on, but the experienced musician will give a dirty look to the person sitting beside them. To summarize, there's no one perfect way to do dance footwork for Castiglione. For whatever one happens to do is perfect, because nobles can do no wrong. Now, of course, the point can be brought up that we are not, in fact, nobles, right? We can, in fact, do wrong and bad things. However, even in a modern, hardly anyone is actually nobility anymore world, we can still take some of the advice from the Book of the Court here. And that is where we are misguided by poor teachers. And I don't mean human teachers here. By this, I more specifically mean that we have very incomplete and dubious sources of information. Think of IKEA instructions. For example, we often look to iconography to inform our dance reconstruction decisions. And although Arbo made the rare choice, and a very nice choice, to have his dance steps descriptions illustrated, he was alone in this, in some senses. And other illustrations that we look to justify the way that something should look, such as dancing in a circle, were not necessarily made by scribes who knew what dancing was, right? We have to remember that the illuminations could be drawn by anyone, a scribe or a monk, or anyone who was just training and for whatever reason didn't know what dances looked like, had never danced that particular dance before. They might have had absolutely no idea what should be represented as. Just as in other fields of study in the SCA, they might not have, other scribes copying manuscripts might have had errors because they weren't actually literate, or they didn't know how to read the musical notation that they were transcribing. So are these resources still useful as tools? Absolutely. But are they infallible? Not even close. We also have textual sources which are very opaque and hard to interpret at all, because they were not really designed for being a manual. They served more as a personal journal. I speak here of the Gresley Papers. They were discovered in England, written around 1500, kind of a transitional repertoire, we think, between 15th and 16th century Italian. They contain a wide variety of dances from a wide variety of cultures. But they were a journal, not a treatise. They weren't designed to instruct on dance. They seemed to be a personal record of dances just for personal mnemonics and remembering. They contain a mixture of dances with and without dance instructions, for example, with and without music. There are no actual step instructions, like other dance treatises. So truly the predecessor to IKEA, or that chair you bought seems to have a screw or 5 missing in the package. To make matters worse, as Mr. Giuseppe Francesco da Borgia noted when he submitted a paper to the Letter of Dance, Volume 5, that because the journal provides no step explanations, all interpretations are, of course, subject to error and speculation. There is a significant amount of disagreement in the dance community about, for example, what a trace should look like. And the same thing goes for racking. To illustrate the latter, Jennifer Neville, in her historical dance journal paper, interpreted this step racking as moving diagonally to the side, leading with whatever foot you happen to be leading with. So if you were leading with the left foot, you'd go diagonally to the left, so on and so forth. It was a single step, so you would step forward with the leading foot, and then the other foot would close. And she made that decision based off of the time it takes to do a rack, which is the same time as a single step. However, by contrast, Mistress Emma Danscona's version has it as a skipping step. It's not a single, it's a skipping or galloping step, which she based off of some possible Middle English dictionary entries that include racking. She has the step usually performed with some kind of flanking or diagonal positioning, similar to Neville's, but it's done face to face with your partner or back to back, and not approaching your partner, as Neville's would sometimes have it. You're never coming together with the racking. Still further, Messer Giuseppe's version has it as more of a zigzag motion, and you go forwards or backwards. And he describes it that it could also be similar to an Italian ripresa portoghese. So it is a reality that should one attend a ball at Penzic, for example, with a Gresley dance in a given set, there will be different versions of said dance performed based on who reconstructed it and who's familiar with what. They are also vastly different reconstructions. Compare that to other dance repertoires we have, where variations in reconstruction and interpretation tend to only produce minor variations. In any case, sometimes we just don't have a lot to go on in some of the sources that we have, and the dances that we come up with are very likely to be different than how they were actually done in period. No one has a video recording. We can't actually ask the authors if what we're doing is right. So there really is no perfect footwork here because we have no idea what it is. We only have our best guesses. And although they are educated best guesses, they're still guesses. So we can continue to make the argument that imperfection here is just, it's the norm. It's going to be the norm. I will admit, however, that there does exist general consensus in some areas of the dance community about what many dance steps mean and should look like. For example, many dance masters and teachers agree that 16th century Italian dance steps should be very small, as Caroso measured them in finger widths. Many dance manuals explain steps in detail, telling us that a double was 3 steps and a close, or that a volto gioioso is a full turn with a ripresa at the end. And yet the study of modernity isn't just for the field of sociology, so I would be remiss not to mention here an experiment that Mistress Felice Stebbage and Lord Luther von Lozengia conducted at Terpsichore at the Tower 20. It was a dance event hosted in Michigan back in 2014. To make a long story short, Master Jamie made a choreography using familiar and established dance steps called Pensic dance. Now, watching the performance, the Honorable Lord Morin Lesseau decided to write down some step instructions that he could take back with him to his own kingdom so he could do the dance there too, teach it to his own dance group. He used established dance terms with the stuff that he wrote down, where it wasn't modern notation, it was period dance notation that the dance community is fairly familiar with at this point. And Mistress Felice and Lord Luther decided to borrow his notes and try and reconstruct it themselves at Terpsichore at the event. And they had never seen it before. They'd never seen it done or even heard the music. And they asked Jamie to come in at the end and assess how well they did. In a way, they were trying to see how likely it is that what we do in the SCA with dance reconstruction is accurate and representative of period dance. Could we reconstruct a dance, quote unquote, perfectly according to the inventor himself? Because we can't actually ask most of the inventor of these dances. They're dead. So the result was a solid no. The first verse of the dance that they reconstructed was mostly the same to the original. The second had a lot more variation, and the third verse was entirely different. Even when using dance terms that we have decided shall mean one thing, there is still room for confusion and misunderstanding, even by these dance experts who reconstruct period dances all the time. And this happens with modern language too, not just with language coming from Old Italian and from authors long dead. Think of modern dance steps, such as sliding to the left in hip-hop. Right? Fairly common. I teach this often to young kids at school and dance class as a basic step. But it's worth noting that when you ask them to slide to the left, some of them will simply slide one foot out to the side and stand there with wide legs. Some of them try to overslide as though they're skateboarding. Still others will slide with the leading left foot and close with the right. Some of them will step with the left foot and slide with the right. Never before had I thought that slide to the left was such a complicated dance step that actually needed modeling, but there you go. Turning is another problematic area. Some students will pivot, like in ballet. Some students will turn in a wide circle, some in 2 steps, some in 4. And some of them will just turn 180, some of them will turn 90 degrees, some of them will turn 360. And I don't even have time to detail how much variation you'd get when you ask them to move like a given animal, such as hopping like a frog or a bunny or kangaroo. Even seemingly standard and simple language that we have modern day still has many different meanings and interpretations. Yet again, our best guesses are all we have, and imperfection follows us. Now, to continue the theme of modernity for just a moment, I'd like to mention that even the most die-hard of tryhards who want to get everything right must admit, no matter how much we enjoy the immersive XVA experience, that we do live in the current Middle Ages. That is to say, we live in a world that's very different from 600 years ago. That might sound obvious, but many often forget how much we voluntarily drop the pretense of being perfect in our footwork in favor of being realistic. Why? Because we say so. Dance classes for old and broken bones, as they are sometimes affectionately entitled, are not unpopular at Step Sprightly and at the Known World Dance Symposium and Pensic and other dance events around the known world in many kingdoms, and they're run by a variety of people, including Mistress Erika Iriarte, who is a widely respected and wise dance laurel. Not a good time, Kat. Who often makes arguments of what is the most correct way to do something. She'll go into a manuscript and say that this is the way you need to do something. But even she will make concessions that the mobility and health needs of our populace demand so-called imperfections in footwork. And so we modify steps so that they're lower impact, perform slower without jumps or hops or deep lunges and rises. And of course, sometimes we have space constraints, right, that the nobility of hundreds of years ago probably didn't, given their wealth and castles and estates and whatnot, that not all of us are as privileged to have. So sometimes steps need to be shorter. We might need to throw in a couple extra turns or adjust a figure so that it rotates. Dancers might need to weave through other sets or couples, etc. There are also times when we change how dances are done for the sake of pure amusement and preference. Natives to Septentria might know of Emander's version of Sellinger's Round, for example, or other regional English country dance variations that are popular among various groups across all kingdoms, and they exist for no other reason that the group prefers it to be done that way. It is common to ask before dancing goddesses, as another example of English country dance, what type of hay is being done at the end. Is it a grand hay, is it a mirror hay, etc. And the dance master will often select the one that the most people are familiar with, or the one that they think will be easiest to teach if no one really knows one. It's also noteworthy to take another repertoire as an example, that although the basse danse form is quite formulaic, hence how the Honourable Lord Daniel and Lady Rosaline were able to fashion a block set, a literal kind of dance calculator, to devise new dances according to the very strict rules of the dance form, the basse danse we tend to perform in the SCA are all the ones that break the rules. And why is that? Well, because they're more interesting that way. So many times we modify things, right? We decide this is the perfect footwork. We're going to make a calculator for it. This is the way you're going to make these new dances. And then we go and dance the ones that break the rules because we say so. And lastly, in our modern world, sometimes new discoveries are made. Given that we're still doing all this research, we're still discovering new manuscripts, we haven't poured through all of the library's contents of the world. We don't know what's still out there. Countess Judith, for example, has recently claimed to discovered a new way to dance Gelosia, Anello, Vestibili Gioioso, other 15th century dances, as just a few examples. And although no doubt she would, I assume, imagine her discoveries to be leading us towards a more perfect reconstruction of said dances, something that is more accurate, I think even she would have to admit that at the end of the day, even her best guesses and estimations, no matter how well supported, are still not infallible. There's no such thing as a perfect vestibule. So to come back to that roadmap for a moment, for the past hour or so, a little under, you've been listening to me ramble about what primary dance sources have to say on making things up, between Caroso and Arbeau and Castiglione and Book of the Courtier, and how others lend themselves to imperfection through misleading or incomplete language and imagery, such as illuminations in the margins of manuscripts or the Gresley papers with its confusing language. You've endured hearing me prattle about present-day reconstruction issues, both in using old dance language, as was discovered through Mistress Felice's experiment at Obsequiary at the Tower, and modern dance language, which we encounter on a day-to-day basis, both of which again lead to a lack of consensus on what constitutes a perfect dance performance. And of course, you've survived my droning about current Middle Age realities that further blur the lens of perfection, where we freely modify dances and step patterns out of necessity half the time, and the other half of the time Plato and preference. All of this is to say that although aiming for mastery is a laudable pursuit, and although we all want to follow instructions we've been given to a T and get it right, and although we can all appreciate the kind of excitement that comes from seeing a familiar dance on a ball set and exclaiming, "Oh my God, I know this one," and just letting your feet do the work for you and not having to think about it, there's still no shame in making a misstep. There is no shame in standing in place because you forgot what to do next. There's no shame in brushing up against someone or in stutter stepping because you started with the wrong foot and now you have to switch to the other one. Nor should you feel bad or like a failure if you move in the wrong direction, or if you begin that chorus too soon, or if you dance slightly offbeat from everyone else. In fact, I could go on at length about how there are some dance exercises where you're supposed to dance offbeat as a form of mastery, but that's not for the moment. Frankly, the few people who are even going to watch you dance, because of how many people end up vacating the premises anyways before the ball begins, will not, chances are, know what is correct. They will not know what the manuscripts say to do. They will not know the footwork. And if they do, and if you make a mistake, a quote unquote mistake, and if they harangue you about it, well, you can just educate them on how your own personal interpretation and variation was not only valid, but made the dance even better, according to Master Arbonne. Just don't call him permissive. We may not flub everything all the time. I don't break out into breakdancing and hip-hop and jazz in the middle of Amoroso when I forget what the heck I'm supposed to do. But even so, allow your fears of not knowing, or of getting it wrong, or of looking silly and being judged to liberate you rather than prevent you from trying. Give yourself permission to do things differently, even if what you did differently was a quote-unquote mistake. Don't sweat the footwork. And that's it. So, are there any questions? You are free to unmute if you wish, or use the chat room. I seem to still have access to that.
Yeah, I was having difficulty. Not a question, but I just wanted, I thought the information you presented was very good and very complete and a lot of very compelling arguments. But I take issue with one straw man that you set up, which is that the laurels of the New World are ready to crush an upstart. Specifically the dance laurels of the world, of whom I expect by now I probably know most of them. And most of them are some of the friendliest people you would want to meet. There are a couple that I find a little bit forbidding, even having known them a little while. But I think even those people would rather that new people, made an effort to learn a dance than that everything was letter perfect, certainly out of the box.
One criticism is not to question authority, Mom? Really?
No, it's that authority is not. Sorry, interloper on the side.
Hello, Helena.
Hello. Sorry, I just woke up.
Anyway, I think most people are friendlier than that. And indeed, I have had in mind, and I haven't done this yet, to circulate an open letter on behalf of the Dance Masters of the Known World saying, no, we are not professionals. Please try this at home. Because, it's better to try. And you'll probably be better than you think, if not the very first time, within a few tries. It's really not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's always someone who doesn't get the memo, but I wouldn't single out the dance laurels for that in particular over the general population. Okay, enough of that rant.
Well, no, I've used you as an example before of how you claim that when you began dance, you didn't know your left from your right. And now look at you, you're literally a dance laurel.
I knew my left from my right. Whether I could make them obey, that was another story entirely. You still here, Robert?
Yep, I'm still here.
Oh, good.
I was going to say he hadn't dropped his connection.
No, I haven't. It's just that when you were speaking, it was stopping all the time.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, I've experienced that. That's partially why I have two laptops set up, because one is very not powerful and doesn't like Zoom, and the other one is a lot better at multitasking. So.
But otherwise, it was a good talk.
Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
I like the way you wove the different threads together. So now we just have, I was also thinking that this would be good fodder for someone to put in the Ursus at some point.
Well, yes. I'm not actually going to be publishing notes for this class because I'm just going to put it in the Ursus, to be honest. I do, though, if you would like, I have two links that I can share with you. So the Honorable Lord Darius, he's a dancer, he's local to us. He recorded the experiment at Terpsichore at the tower. He actually showed the result of it. So one of the videos that links I'm going to share with you right now in the chat. One of the videos is the class itself as Mistress Felice is teaching it as she's reconstructing it. So you can see the process that she's going through, and she's actually looking at the notes and deciding what instructions to give the class. I believe the second video is Jamie going through and actually showing what the dance should look like. So you can kind of see the side-by-side, or the comparison. So I think those links are in there now. Not seeing on my other laptop. Oh, I see what I've done. I didn't know you could chat with someone privately in these chats. Well, there you go. There, so now they're shared with everyone. So those two links would take you to Darius, I think Darius' YouTube channel. If not his, someone else's. And they show you the whole process of that experiment and just the results, and you see what it's like to reconstruct in real time, and and the errors that came up as a result, just further prove the point that as much as, we still do this because we love it, right? We're not going to stop reconstructing dance just because there's the possibility, a very real possibility, that we're doing it all wrong. But it's fun. I mean, dancing is still fun. It's still a good exercise to go through and see, if we can figure things out, because it's like a puzzle. But it certainly is a good reminder to be humble and have some humility with our dance reconstructions and not claim that they are perfect or that the footwork that we do, right, is perfect. Much as I'm sure that makes Caruso turn in his grave, but well, that's Caruso.